Welcome, colleagues. We're still admitting folks, but we're going to start this conversation. I'm Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the Darth Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of Columbia Journalism School in New York City devoted to improving reporting on violence, conflict, and tragedy, and innovative, ethical, effective reporting on all of those issues. We're here for the 10th iteration of our ongoing series, Reporting and COVID-19, Conversations for Journalists. I emphasize the "and" in this title for the series because our purpose is to discuss the full range of journalistic issues that emerge as we work amid this pandemic, not just reporting on the pandemic itself. Today, we're here to talk about information security. And I am joined in this panel, which is co-sponsored not only by Columbia Journalism Review, which is our perpetual co-sponsor, but also in this case by my colleagues at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia. I'm joined by Jennifer Henrichsen. Jen Henrichsen is a PhD candidate at the Annenberg School for Communication, but she is also the author of a very important report just published today by the Tao Center called The Rise of the Security Champion, Beta Testing Newsroom Security. She has been a Knight Fellow at the Tao Center. She's her scholarship is in the areas of how journalism has changed, how information security has changed in an era of surveillance. She's also researched and written for UNESCO, where she co-wrote their annual report on freedom of the press. And she's also the co-author or co-editor of two books, War on Words, Who Should Protect Journalists, and Journalism After Snowden, both of which are worth pulling out of the Amazon pile if you can. Jen, welcome. Very glad to have you here.
Thanks. Great to be here.
For those of you who have not been one of these conversations before, Jen and I will talk for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, and then we'll turn the floor over to you. Questions should come through the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So if a question occurs as you are listening, or once we switch over to the question period, just chat away and we'll call questions out, read them out, consolidate them, do whatever we can to make the conversation go in interesting directions. Jen, we'll get to your report, The Rise of the Security Champion, in a couple of minutes, but we are here, a few weeks into this unprecedented coronavirus lockdown, which is challenging journalism in all kinds of ways. On the digital security and information security front, what do you see as some of the novel challenges posed by this novel situation and this novel coronavirus?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the first things that comes to mind is just how sequestered most journalists are right now, working from their homes, not necessarily even in coffee shops and definitely not at the office. And so then it comes down to trying to make sure that their own security setups are pretty robust as they go about doing their work and connecting with colleagues through various channels or talking to sources and things like that. And so one of the recommendations that Freedom of the Press organization and others have put forward is to try to make sure that your router security is strong. So making sure that you've changed the admin credentials, making sure that you have a strong password on it, making sure that updates to the firmware are occurring. I actually just talked to a digital security specialist, and he was saying that he automated his updates, but he actually has to go in and check to make sure that they happen. So just FYI. And then just also the fact that, communications are even more decentralized now, and understanding how that affects the work that you might be trying to do with sources, or communicating with your colleagues through different channels, and making sure that if you need your conversations to be protected from an encryption standpoint, making sure that you're using the right tools and platforms to ensure that that's the case. So there are a lot of different specific technical things that you can be doing from home. But also, I mean, there's the element of the emotional component of working from home all day, you know, not having your colleagues to bounce ideas off of, and trying to make sure that you also have self-care elements embedded in your day as well.
And we may return to, I'm sure we'll return in the Q&A to some of the issues very specific to this moment. Let's now back up and talk about your report. It has this completely fascinating title, which, and by the way, my colleague Ariel has shared a copy of the report with everyone on Zoom via the Zoom chat. The Rise of the Security Champion. It sounds like a Schwarzenegger sequel. Why that title? What does that mean? Take us through the highlights of this report, and in particular, why this title, The Rise of the Security Champion, not something some of us have thought about so much.
Sure. So in the report, what I was realizing, so the report is based on 30 different interviews that I conducted from February to December of 2019. And the interviews are with journalists and information security technologists, media lawyers, a couple people from academia, and also nonprofit organizations that focus on security. But what I was finding is that, first of all, security cultures, and that's what I'm terming them to be, security cultures, tend to be very nascent in many news organizations that I talked about and talked to. And there are many reasons for that.
By nascent, meaning kind of just...
Oh, new, like emerging, not solidified. Not necessarily comprehensive. There's not necessarily a conversation between the corporate side and editorial in some cases, things like that. And so there's a lot of factors behind why these cultures are nascent, including, you know, financial instability for news organizations, ongoing labor precarity for journalists and also freelancers, and in turn, limited pushback or limited ability for editors and management to try to allocate resources in order to encourage greater and more robust security across the news organization and across the organization as a whole. And so what I found was that it often came to the fore when individuals, whether they were journalists or IT members or media lawyers, really across the news organization in many ways, they had an interest in security. They thought it was valuable to their colleagues and to the news organization and to themselves. And they started to learn about it themselves, and they decided to sort of bring it to the attention of their peers through brown bag sessions and informal conversations and desks talking to one another and things like that, in order to try to infuse security from the bottom up. And it's just really interesting how the security champions are across the organization, but they also did tend to skew a little bit younger in age, more technologically affiliated or comfortable, but at the same time, it wasn't necessarily the only actors that you would expect, like the investigative team or the national security desk or things like that. It was much broader in terms of beat and in terms of even expertise. So it really came down to sort of an interest in technology, a curiosity, and a belief that this was important for not only them to implement, but also for their peers to understand and for the organization as a whole to sort of get behind.
This resonates for me. A couple months ago, I paid a visit to a local newsroom in the Northeast, where basically there were a couple people on the staff. It was a small regional news organization, not a big one. They thought of themselves as a local news outlet. But there was one person on the staff, in that case, a technologist, who was the person taking it seriously, who was saying, you know, we got to upgrade, we need to figure out what encryption to use. This individual felt they were getting not much of a hearing until a sustained campaign of abuse and harassment at a couple of reporters, and doxing started to bubble up. And then suddenly there was much wider interest, particularly from managers. Is that a kind of typical pattern?
Yes, I found that in my research as well. And actually, that's the one element that seems, I mean, it's still reactive. Security is still reactive in that sense, but I found that individual journalists were more likely to pay attention to wanting to know more about information security, and by extension, editors, because they were concerned about online harassment that they were anticipating, maybe based on the story content that they were going to be publishing, or because they had a friend or a colleague who had just experienced online harassment or doxing in some cases. And yeah, so that actually is one of the #1 concerns in news organizations, according to a survey by the Committee to Protect Journalists out of, that was from 2019, in terms of safety. Like, one of the major issues is online harassment and by extension, doxing.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that it sort of has to happen for editors and management to sort of be able to respond at that time.
But I think, you know, that runs parallel to the history of other kinds of safety and security. Certainly the history of physical security in newsrooms, safety training, the history of trauma awareness. Very often it has, you'll have 1 or 2 people who care a lot, nobody else in the newsroom who is paying attention, and then suddenly there's a crisis and it becomes very relevant, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious, since I assume, you know, the folks who are on this call, on this webinar, many are likely to be interested in making these changes or fostering a healthy security environment right now. What is it that makes an effective security champion? They're a diverse lot. You said, as you said, they range across age and across discipline: investigative reporters, technology folks, breaking news folks. But what seems to make an effective security champion, an effective agent of change inside a news organization?
I would say that something that came up and came through the interviews was the fact that a security champion had to be really passionate about the issue and had to push and not really ask for permission, and just go ahead with different ideas that they had, try to organize a brown bag session about signal or a different type of technology, and really sort of do the legwork themselves in order to bring it to the attention of their colleagues and to their editors. So that's one component. So
there is a kind of an action component. Don't wait for the company to do it. Create some facts on the ground, right?
Yes, definitely, absolutely. And stay in conversation with security experts and technologists who might be working in some news organizations or who might be working at nonprofit organizations, as they are a great source for up-to-date information that you can then provide to your newsroom and to your colleagues.
What about the challenge, you know, the other challenge to newsroom culture and security, besides that the bosses don't care until they have to, is that we are a very freewheeling news culture all over the world. Journalists tend to be kind of anti-authoritarian. We don't like to be told what to do, and also are very often deeply engaged, are primarily worried about our stories, our sources, and kind of not so much about ourselves. How do these champions successfully engage around these new practices, around adopting these innovations in safety and security?
What I think is interesting about that is I think maybe the performance element of not caring about yourself is on display in journalism, but I wouldn't say that that actually relates to security concerns in journalism, because journalists do care if they are worried about online harassment, or they do care about harassment, they do care about doxing, and that's sort of when they are deciding whether or not to take certain steps in order to protect themselves. So I actually would say that that is slightly different. Yeah. But I was focused on that. Can you mention again the broader question?
Oh, well, just how, to the extent that security consciousness is a challenge or is in tension with the kind of freewheeling culture of newsrooms that drew a lot of us into this in the first place. How do the security champions break through and do some culture change around this?
I mean, I think a big part of that is making sure that security fits journalism and not the other way around. Because if you just sort of suggest, you know, XYZ is necessary and not describe why it's important or how it fits with journalistic workflows and the temporal demands and the deadlines that journalists face on a daily basis, then you're not going to have much success. So you really got to make sure that it works with the culture of the organization, the culture of adaptation to technology, and make sure that there is motivation for the journalist to engage in it. So for example, journalists are more likely to engage in it if they think that it will help protect themselves, right, from doxing or online harassment, or they're more likely to engage in security practices if they really feel that they need to do so in order to protect their sources. And that's more, again, for investigative or sometimes business or national security reporters. But there's also an element too of it's like a signaling mechanism that I've found where journalists will show that they use Signal, or show that in the past it was PGP encryption and they would have their PGP key on the Twitter feed or whatnot, on their Twitter profile. It was a signaling mechanism to show future and potential sources that they take this seriously and can be trusted with information.
So it's security signaling as opposed to virtue signaling, I guess, is how to think about it. Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. What there are in your report, you mention some tensions with traditional reporting imperatives like speed, some tensions around how far reporters should go in protecting sources. Are there practices that insulate sources more than we should? Does it get us into bed with sources? Talk a little bit about those tensions and how they play out.
So speed was probably the most predominant tension that I came across, which is not surprising because of the temporal demands that journalists face. But basically, if a journalist thought that a security tool would slow their process down in such a way that was not helpful for them to get the story or to protect the source, they were much less likely to want to even engage in that security process. And that makes sense. So that goes back to the point of trying to make sure that security does fit the journalistic dimensions and paradigms that you're working within. And then also visibility is a tension too, which I've come across. It's interesting because, you know, journalists have a public persona through different social media platforms. Typically, they're trying to be engaged on those platforms. They're trying to be visible. They're trying to make sure that they have open communication channels for potential tips or for, you know, future sources to get in contact with them. But then at the same time, those can be used as channels for abuse. And so one recommendation I had to a local news organization that I provided a anti-doxing seminar to was, you don't have to have your Twitter DMs open all the time. Like if you're worried as a journalist that your published story or soon to be published story is going to result in a lot of abuse based on the content of the story or whatnot, just close that off for a little bit. You know, it's a better way to provide some care for your journalist while still having other avenues for actual sources to get information to you.
So this is a way in which security consciousness or security championing is in part just affecting kind of common sense day-to-day choices, adding some fairly simple choices that aren't high tech, that aren't about changing the way you work, just saying deep breath, how could we solve this? Right? Jen, talk a little bit about doxing. I think for people who aren't investigative reporters or who haven't been the target of it, they may not even know what doxing is or why we care so much about it. Talk a bit about it, would you?
Yeah, sure. So doxing is when somebody collects personal information about you and then publishes it on the internet for other people or for that person to harass and intimidate the journalist. And it's pretty easy to do, and a lot of people are experiencing it. So one of the ways that you can try to reduce the threat of it for yourself is to first understand what information, personal information, is out there about you. So doing, you know, just simple searches through different search engines with, you know, your name plus your email address, or your name plus your phone number, your name plus your physical address, to try to get a sense of where does the information live, how much of it is out there. And then understanding that it's often aggregated on different data sites or, you know, people search finder type sites, and understanding that there are certain processes that you need to then engage in to try to remove that data. That's the hard part though, is that you can remove it and then it can come back because of the ways in which information about us is being collected all the time and sold. And it's very difficult in the US to have protections related to that. So there are some companies that provide the service to you that you pay for, but you can also engage in the process yourself. And I'm happy to share a presentation that I did on that. Also, the New York Times, I was just talking to an information security specialist at the New York Times yesterday, and she mentioned that one of their guides that they have been using internally, they've made it open access. And it can walk you through how to prevent doxing, or at least how to mitigate doxing, and the different specific steps that you can take. So I'm happy to share that in the chat after this, because
Yeah.
it's quite comprehensive and it's been really effective for them.
Along with, I mean, doxing is a particular source of threat and harassment because it can leave journalists feeling exposed, and so the advice to dox yourself as an
Right.
exercise is
Right.
really well taken, and it's something I find myself saying to a lot of newsrooms. Besides doxing, what do you now think are the most important security challenges and risks to reporters? And I'm thinking mainly of local reporters around the world, not, you know, I mean, investigative or national security reporters are thinking a lot about security of sources, a lot about their own security. But for the rest of us who are trying to go out and just do today's story, cover courts, cover coronavirus, cover whatever we're reporting on, what do you see as the most important vulnerabilities and threats in kind of the current environment?
You know, it still, to me, comes back quite a bit to harassment, because people are experiencing that at all levels. And now, even in relationship to non-controversial stories, minority journalists tend to experience it more than non-minority journalists. Female journalists tend to experience it more than male journalists, things like that. So I guess that would still be one of the first things that I would suggest, is understanding what information is there out there about you and how to mitigate that information. But there are also a lot of just basic best practices that security experts recommend that anyone can implement, and that you don't have to be covering, you know, a government level source to engage in it and for it to help both the security of your accounts or the security of your newsroom. So, I mean, that's some really basic stuff, and more newsrooms are doing this. But for example, it's enabling two-factor authentication on your accounts and understanding the differences with the types of two-factor authentication, because now that's become a little bit of an issue. So for example, it's better to have like a Google Authenticator, for example, rather than getting the code by SMS for a variety of reasons. But so that's like one very basic step. And that actually is also relevant now because a lot of folks are away from their newsroom, right? So they're engaging in accessing accounts from their home or whatnot. So having the two-factor authentication is also useful to better protect the accounts that they are trying to access from home. And then a big thing still, and actually this was also spotlighted by coronavirus, again, but it's been an issue for a while, is just understanding what phishing looks like, or what it could look like, and trying to make sure that you don't click on messages or enter login information to a fraudulent message that is a phishing attack on you, which will then compromise, you know, your accounts again, and could play havoc on the newsroom depending on which accounts were breached. And then something that I've been trying to talk about for a while now with journalists is just the importance of understanding how to create a threat assessment or threat model. And it sounds very intimidating, perhaps. It is something that a lot of security experts have been talking about for a while. It seems like there's some resistance to it. And I don't know if it's because it's just not, you have to really take the time to think through different questions related to the risk assessment and then create a plan. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll go to questions from the crowd in a minute, but
okay.
but walk us through that. Walk us. So if I'm I'm a reporter, a local reporter in New Haven, Connecticut, where I'm actually sitting now, or if I'm if I'm a journalist in Kashmir or anywhere, and I want to do a basic digital risk assessment, what does that look like? Walk me through it.
Sure. I mean, it's essentially asking yourself a variety of questions. So it usually starts with, what information are you trying to protect? And then who might be interested in that information? And then how likely is it that somebody could actually access that information? And what is the harm that could happen if they did indeed access that information? And then based on your answers to those questions, you develop a plan that has specific technical steps to try to mitigate the possibility that somebody could access the information that you're trying to protect.
Okay, so and what about if I'm kind of sitting here in New Haven and I've just done a politically polarizing story about coronavirus response, and I'm worried about being trolled or abused online or other things. What are a few steps I should be taking proactively now? And I
So
say this in
yeah.
particular because I think one of the coronavirus in some ways doesn't create a new situation, but it does raise the emotional stakes for all kinds of reporters
Mhm.
in how in how politicians' actions are described,
Mhm.
in the steps that local governments and national governments are taking, and there's a highly overwrought, polarized social media response that reporters now have to absorb. So talk
Mhm.
us through that a
Mhm.
little bit.
So with that, I would try to first understand what information about you personally and maybe about your immediate family members is available online, and try to remove it from different websites, data collectors, things like that. And then I'd also go through your social media accounts and lock them down in more depth. I mean, the problem is a lot of the requirements or privacy restrictions or whatnot change pretty quickly on social media accounts. So if you've done this like 4 months ago, it might not be enough right now. So just trying to understand that any information about yourself that you might not want available, like that you have children that are young, or that you have, I don't know, anything that could be hurtful, I guess, to you
Yeah.
or your family, or for your ability to carry out your work, you want to kind of lock down that information as much as you can, with the understanding that it's an iterative process and that you're going to have to keep dealing with that a bit. But also maybe temporarily, you know, limit the DM, like don't let those be open for a little bit, or different ways of limiting access to you might be helpful. Or if harassment's already happening, you know, have somebody else take over your account for a little bit until it dies down. Maybe if it's really severe, escalate it to your editor to see if there are other solutions that could be happening in the newsroom. I know that some organizations have 24/7 hotlines that journalists can call to get advice, to understand, you know, when does it escalate from a verbal threat to actually like a physical security concern. That's a really hard line to determine. So some news organizations are offering options for journalists to call in to try to get that expertise and that assessment. And then I guess along those lines, which would help secure your accounts, is to make sure that you're using, I mean, it sounds very basic and maybe boring, but, you know, making sure that you're using really complicated passwords and making sure that
Yeah.
they are unique. You can actually search to see which ones might have already been exposed through a variety of sites. And if you actually have credit monitoring or other types of monitoring set up because there's been a breach in the past, they will also often flag the fact that a certain password associated with a certain account has been breached and that it's on the dark web or somewhere else, and that you probably should try to change it at
Yeah.
that point in time. And one way to make more complicated passwords is to use a password manager, because it can be randomized passwords that are really complicated that no one's going to guess. And then it's also handy for you to be able to access it remotely, depending on which password manager that you use.
Folks, if you have questions for Jen, please type them into the chat, and we'll sort of take them as they come, as we indeed have already started doing. But please do. In the meantime, I want to go back to kind of coronavirus and where it
Okay.
intersects with your report. Um, there's been a very abrupt transition to working at home.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, freelancers are always working at home, but for everybody else, there's a very abrupt transition. Has that disrupted the work of champions?
Mm-hmm.
And how has it otherwise stretched emerging newsroom security consciousness?
Mm-hmm. I will say that I'm not entirely sure of the answer because my research was done before coronavirus happened,
Right.
even though it was just published online today.
Yeah.
I will say though, I mean, in some ways, this is like a perfect opportunity to champion security because everybody is in different locations, right? So it's almost more obvious the need
Mm-hmm.
for it than perhaps it was in the past when you're not all sitting in the same physical space, but a lot of you are. IT's down the hall or whatever. So in some ways, I would say it would almost make it easier, but on the flip side, it won't
Yeah.
because of the financial precarity that newsrooms are increasingly facing as it relates to coronavirus. So I think that's a question to look at and to assess. I don't think I have
Mm-hmm.
an answer per se that's backed
But
up by.
it's something the folks on in webinar today might have
Yeah,
thoughts on.
that's true.
A question from Barbie Zeller, who asks, Zelzer, who asks, does the invocation of the champion suggest a long-standing model of peer-to-peer interaction in the newsroom around different kinds of topics? And I suppose I'd add to that there is, to my mind, a rich tradition of mentoring and collegiality in the news profession around the world. How does the security champion differ, Barbie Zellizer wants to know, from other kinds of champions or other kinds of mentoring?
I guess, I mean, my first reaction is yes, absolutely. It does sort of mimic the peer-to-peer learning that is best achieved typically in newsrooms, and just sort of how the socialization of norms tend to occur as you work in a newsroom. I guess the main difference that comes to my mind is that security champions are not necessarily just the journalist, right? So you have folks from the IT department. You might have, depending on the news organization, information security technologists. And so there's a hybrid quality to who is informing and making important decisions, and maybe challenging who is considered to be more predominant in the newsroom, because the champion model can be almost anybody.
So Maria Arce, who's a Dart Center Rockberg Fellow from a few years ago, asks, if you were to advise a small newsroom on what are the first 3 steps they need to embrace information security, what would they be? She asks because small newsrooms usually don't have resources. They may not have even a dedicated tech security person. What are 3 simple things that even a small newsroom could do?
I think the first one would be to encourage password management use by your employees. And actually, 1Password has an offering of free accounts for journalists, and it's considered a good password manager among many in the security community. So that would be one. That would help limit quite a few problems potentially. Second one would be to make sure that you enable 2-factor authentication on all your accounts. And that's usually free too, unless you're using hardware tokens, which is sort of a step up. But even in that case, sometimes the companies will give those to you free if you're a news organization or you're a freelance journalist, if you can show that you are. So those would be the first 2. And then, I mean, I'm almost tempted to not say something technical and instead just try to foster a climate where concerns related to security and interests related to security can blossom. So a lot of folks that I talk to who don't have resources for this type of thing, they don't have a team of information security specialists, they have brown bag sessions. You know, maybe it's once a week or once a month in lieu of a different type of meeting, and that you can come together and utilize free resources online, such as through actually the Open News developed this field guide for developing security in newsrooms, and it's a modular approach. I helped with the guide. It came out a couple of years ago, so you also would want to make sure that everything that we suggested is still relevant today. But it's been used by quite a few journalists in their newsrooms, especially in local places and small news organizations, to try to just start a conversation related to security and develop a literacy among the employees there about what might be important for them.
I think that mirrors other kinds of changes in news culture, which, you know, newsrooms have always innovated most effectively based on those kinds of informal conversations. And chances are there's already somebody, even in a small newsroom, who's thinking at least a little bit about this. So I'm actually very glad you put that sort of informal brown bag conversation. I think that's the most important thing in any kind of newsroom culture change, because that's the only way you're going to get buy-in and long-term results.
And oftentimes the brown bag will lead to maybe a more regular meeting, for example, or that, you know, it's a starting point, and then you can expand it out and make it more of a ritual within the news organization.
Heleta Yerga asks from Ethiopia, do you see governments and industry relinquishing the surveillance technologies that they're being developed for coronavirus contact tracing? Are there any security measures that we are going to need to add to the journalistic palette in light of authoritarian governments abusing contact tracing?
I would say that this is definitely a concern and something that we're seeing in many countries around the world, like the utilization of different technologies to facilitate surveillance, especially in a situation where it's maybe perceived as less negative because people are like, oh, it would help, you know, trace who has it and limit this pandemic's effects. I would say that maybe the most basic response to that would be to try to understand how your information is flowing, how you might be implicated in such sort of surveillance attempts, and then try to make a plan to obscure your communications through encryption, or to try to limit the first contact problem, which is a problem when you, so that basically means if you are using encrypted communications, let's say you're using Signal, right, to have a chat, for example, the content is protected from an encryption standpoint, so it's obscured, people can't read it, but Signal, even though they don't collect the information, so maybe not the best example, but the contact, right, that you have with somebody else, that's the metadata, and that's available. So I guess understanding the differences between ways to protect the content and ways to protect the metadata, which is very hard, would be valuable when thinking about how different authoritarian governments are trying to utilize technologies to conduct more surveillance under the auspices of limiting the pandemic's effects.
Certainly, I think also if some governments may are beginning to adopt Bluetooth-based apps for certain kinds of contact tracing and health surveillance, and that means that at a minimum, if you're a reporter and you're meeting sources or engaging in it, you at least want to be aware of what the technology is and how it relates to what you're doing. So
and maybe turn Bluetooth off more frequently or not have it on at all, or leave your phone with somebody else, right? Or use a different phone for that conversation that's maybe not connected to the internet. You know, there are different steps that you can take, but it will be more difficult for sure.
And again, folks, if you have questions for Jen, please throw them into the chat and we'll get to them as well as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. Jen, as you look around the world at the very rapidly evolving world of security threats to journalists and security innovations and responses, what are the threats that worry you the most? If I'm looking forward from now to a year or 2 years from now, what are the rest of us not looking at that we should be thinking about a little bit?
And we're saying across the world or in the US?
Take your pick.
Okay. I guess I would say that one of the most concerning things to me right now is the constant demonization of the press within the US and what that means for lowering trust levels in the media and what that means more specifically for a democratic society which might rely on it. That is one component. I guess the other component is it does seem like populist governments and authoritarian governments are on the rise throughout the world. And one of the quickest ways to sort of consolidate power or to make sure that it's not mitigated is to attack the press, either physically or digitally or a combination of both, rhetorically, which we are seeing as well. So I guess my concern is we're going to probably see an increase in that and an escalation in that. And I don't know if we're really fighting back against that in the best way that we could be as journalists and as news organizations. And I think part of that issue is we don't want to enter the fray. We don't want to be perceived as biased, but there are certain ways to change how you report in order to limit how you magnify certain levels of misinformation.
Chris Woodside is wondering, could you give advice about Facebook? Do you think Facebook is a poor way for journalists to interact with the public or an okay way? And I should say this gets to, you can answer that, and then the next one, which is how to handle the imperative to audience engagement, to social media engagement, even as we're putting up some new barriers to protect us. But start with Facebook, and then we'll maybe broaden it out a little bit.
I mean, I guess I would want to know more about that question. So are you asking if it's like a good way to engage with Facebook from a engage with the public through Facebook?
I think as I understand Chris Woodside's question, it's from, Facebook messaging and using your own Facebook page as a vehicle for audience engagement and source
Okay.
engagement and everything else. What do you
Okay.
think about it?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would limit that if possible. It depends on where you're at, though, in the world to an extent, because certain places, Facebook is the internet. Um, but I would hesitate if you want, I mean, it depends on the level of protection that you'd want for your sources and for the content of your communication.
Mhm.
So I would recommend, even though I don't know which specific location you're operating out of, I would recommend limiting that just because it's owned by Facebook. It's open to, legal maneuvers by governments if they want to engage with what you're doing or to understand what you're doing. And maybe go to something that is encrypted and does not rely on or does not allow for governments or others to access the contents of the communications. And so I'm thinking right now of Signal, super easy to use. It is encrypted. It seems to be, it has a good track record in terms of its security. It's continually vetted and it's free. So that's also helpful. And that's a way to sort of get away from the personal dimension of Facebook with your own profile. It allows the content to be encrypted, which is better, typically for your source and for yourself.
How are, as journalists, we live our lives like everyone does on social media
Yeah,
now.
sure.
And people often kind of are dealing on the one hand with family and friends, and on the other hand, in the same account or at least the same space, dealing with their professional identity and professional community. What do you think the best way to navigate the push and pull between the personal use of social media and the professional social media identity is?
I mean, I would recommend having different accounts and or having different avenues for your professional life or your personal life. So for example, for me, Twitter is my professional extension of myself. I don't post typically about family or personal pictures or anything like that. And that's fine with me. But then other social media sites like Facebook, for example, it's a much smaller audience and there's a specific sort of ethos behind it and an expectation of who I'm trying to engage and what I'm willing to put out there. So I guess as much as you can, maybe trying to separate either which platform you used for what or having different accounts for each platform to try to reach the audiences that you wish to reach, but doing so in a way that also doesn't compromise a lot of personal information about yourself.
Let me ask you, well, let me ask one more question from the room, and then I'll have a closing question.
Okay.
Nick Church, again, is asking, from an operations perspective, does cybersecurity need to be an enforced issue in the workplace, or is it merely encouraging it? That's kind of a news organization policy question, right? But how do we think about that?
I mean, I think it needs to be a little bit of both. So one organization that I interviewed who's been doing pretty well in the information security space, it's just an expectation for any reporter who joins the organization that they use certain mechanisms for security, and that's just part of it. Like that's just what you do if you go there and work there. That said, they're an investigative outlet and sort of, they're known for their investigative pieces and their Snowden documents and things like that. So it's sort of accepted. But because it's enforced at that level, both through policies and also just a socialization of norms, people are more likely to engage with it, right, in a way that's comprehensive. But at the same time, you don't want policies to not work with the journalists who you're trying to affect. So it's really about a give and take with understanding, okay, what are the journalists' needs? How do you make sure that they're able to access the information that they might need to access? Like, do they need to be on tour? Like, you can't block tour then as a newsroom, for example. Like, you got to make sure that whatever you do decide does work with the people that you're trying to engage with. So it's a little bit of both. It's not really one or the other.
And again, it goes to this issue that you raised in your report of finding security practices that are consistent with journalism practice, that are rooted in journalism practice, rather than trying to graft some outside set of recommendations on top of it.
And on that, it's because journalists will circumvent it if they don't like it. And you don't want to have that, because then that could introduce a whole bunch of new vulnerabilities that then the IT department's not even aware of. So you really have to work comprehensively together on it.
So let me ask you one last thing, and this will take us back both to your report and to COVID-19.
Okay.
You know, there's a lot of, we're reporting now in a very grim and challenging news environment where a lot is uncertain about the future of our profession. So I wanted to actually close by asking you to identify some good news, or at least kind of positive trends. As you explored the security landscape for your report, which again is shared with everyone in the chat. As you explored the landscape, interviewed folks, what would you say are the most encouraging developments you're finding in this period when journalists are under attack and being abused and all this? What's the good news out of this?
I mean, I guess the good news that first comes to mind is that people really want good information, and people are, you know, subscribing to certain news websites and things more than they had in the past. To an extent, it depends on the news organization. So that's not a panacea, but certain places are seeing a bump in subscriptions and are able to then, you know, carry out really rigorous and investigative type reporting that on issues that merit, you know, examination. I guess the other thing is the fact that it's possible. I mean, the fact that individuals within a news organization who just really happen to care about security and think that it's important for others in the news organization to also care about it are able to affect some elements of change, right? So it doesn't have to be top down, and in some cases top down probably wouldn't work. It does need to be a blend of both, but the fact that you have somebody from the IT department and you have somebody from, I don't know, maybe even the style section who cares about it, and that can actually change practices, I think that's a positive, and that's maybe somewhat surprising considering how important security is and also sometimes how difficult it is to implement.
I think that is an excellent and very positive place to end the conversation on. And in fact, the good news is embedded in the title of your report,
There we go.
the Rise of the Security Champion. So Jennifer Henrichsen, thank you. I want to thank Emily Bell and the crew at the Tau Center for helping make this particular Dart Center Zoominar possible. Also, Columbia Journalism Review, which has been co-sponsoring this entire series of conversations. Susan Kaplan, who is somewhere lurking, collecting information for the Dart Center's running coronavirus tip sheet that we are sharing on our website. Ariel Richin and Kate Black from the Dart Center, who have been driving the car in the background, and all of you who are on the webinar today. We'll be back next week. Watch our social media feeds and website for updates on what's coming next. Thank you all.